Genesis 6 says the Nephilim existed on earth before the flood. God sent the waters to destroy all corrupted flesh. 40 days of rain, 150 days submerged. Nothing survived. But Numbers 13, written centuries later, mentions giants descended from the Nephilim in Canaan. If they all died, how did they reappear? This paradox has troubled scholars for millennia. It's not a minor detail hidden in some theological footnote. It's an apparent contradiction in the sacred text itself that demands explanation. And the possible answers completely change how we understand both the flood and the very nature of the Nephilim themselves. They also change how we understand the conquest of Canaan, David's wars, and even the purpose behind the extermination ordered against specific peoples. To understand what happened after the flood, we first need to understand what existed before. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, describes an event that has disturbed readers since antiquity. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives for themselves from among all they chose. The result of this union were the Nephilim, described as the mighty men of old, men of renown. The Hebrew word Nephilim derives from the root naphal, meaning to fall. They were the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. The term carries intentional ambiguity that resonates through centuries of interpretation. But who were the sons of God? The oldest interpretation, found in the Book of Enoch and defended by virtually every Jewish writer of the Second Temple period, understood the sons of God as angelic beings, angels who abandoned their celestial position, their proper dwelling as Jude 6 describes, and cohabited with human women. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records this interpretation as the accepted view of his time. The early church fathers, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, all defended this reading. The result of this unnatural union was hybrid offspring, beings who were neither completely human nor completely spiritual. A genetic corruption that carried characteristics of both natures but belonged fully to neither. And this contamination spread rapidly across the antediluvian earth. Here is the crucial context that many ignore when reading the flood account. The catastrophe didn't come merely because of generic human wickedness. Genesis 6, verse 12, specifies that God looked upon the earth and saw it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The Hebrew word for corrupted is shakat, which implies deterioration, ruin, destruction of the original form. Something had happened to the very biological nature of humanity. The contamination was physical, not merely moral. The original form created by God was being destroyed from the inside out, and the text is even more specific. All flesh had corrupted its way, not just humans, all flesh. Some scholars suggest the contamination extended even to the animal kingdom, explaining why God needed to destroy the land animals as well, and not just humanity. The corruption had spread beyond human boundaries. Noah was chosen for a specific reason that goes beyond his moral righteousness. Genesis 6, verse 9 says Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries, and he walked with God. But there's a word in that verse that carries extraordinary weight. The Hebrew word tamim, translated as blameless or perfect, is the same word used in Leviticus to describe unblemished animals offered in sacrifice. It means complete, without mixture, without physical defect. When applied to Noah's generations, it suggests his genetic lineage remained pure, uncontaminated by the hybridization that had infected the rest of humanity. Noah wasn't just a good man in a bad world. He was a genetically intact man in a genetically corrupted world. His family represented the last reservoir of pure human DNA on Earth, and God needed to preserve that. The flood, from this perspective, was a genetic reset, a radical way to preserve the original human lineage through a single family while eliminating all contamination. The waters covered the earth for 150 days. They rose more than 7 meters above the highest mountains. Every creature that breathed died. All flesh was destroyed, including, presumably, all the Nephilim and all humans who carried their corrupted genetics. 8 people survived. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. No one else. Humanity started over from zero with a family of pure lineage. And then comes the problem that no simple explanation resolves. 480 years after the waters receded, 430 years after Abraham entered Canaan, Moses sends 12 spies to scout the Promised Land. They cross the desert, climb through the mountains, explore from south to north for 40 days, and they return with a report that paralyzes the entire nation with fear. The land we passed through to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants. All the people we saw in it are men of great stature. We also saw the giants there, the sons of Anak, descendants of the giants. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Numbers 13, verses 32 and 33. And here's the detail that transforms curiosity into theological crisis. The word used in the Hebrew text is Nephilim, not a similar word, not a synonym, the exact same term used in Genesis 6 to describe the antediluvian hybrids who supposedly had been completely exterminated. The spies weren't using figurative language to describe tall men. They were identifying a specific category of beings who, according to the earlier record, should no longer exist anywhere on Earth. 10 of the 12 spies refused to advance, and because of their fear, an entire generation died in the wilderness. 40 years of wandering because Israel didn't believe they could defeat the Nephilim a second time. 3 main theories attempt to resolve this apparent contradiction in Scripture. The first theory suggests the term Nephilim in the spies' report was hyperbolic, an emotional exaggeration from frightened men. The Israelites, after 430 years of slavery in Egypt, 430 years without military experience, encountered Canaanite peoples of impressive stature and used the most terrifying term they knew from their oral traditions. Calling them Nephilim was a way to express extreme fear, not a literal identification of biological category. According to this view, the giants of Canaan were normal humans, simply taller and more intimidating than the Israelites freshly freed from slavery. Panic made the spies see monsters where there were only well-trained warriors. The problem with this theory is the specificity of the text. Numbers 13 doesn't just say they were large as if they were Nephilim. It says they were descendants of the Nephilim, sons of Anak. The genealogy is too detailed to be mere emotional hyperbole. The spies identified specific clans, specific names, specific lineages, and more importantly, other biblical texts treat these giants as a real category, not as exaggeration. Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Samuel all describe specific military campaigns against peoples of anomalous stature. They record their names, their cities, their defeats. They treat their existence as historical fact, not as metaphor. The second theory proposes the flood wasn't geographically universal. It covered a specific region of the ancient world, not the entire planet. The Nephilim in distant areas would have survived simply because the waters never reached them. When Noah's descendants spread out in subsequent generations, they eventually encountered Nephilim populations that had remained isolated during the flood event. This theory elegantly solves the Nephilim paradox. If the flood was local, there's no contradiction in finding survivors outside the affected area. But it creates other significant textual problems. Genesis is emphatic, almost exhaustive, about the extent of the flood. All flesh that moved on the earth perished. Every being in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Everything on dry land died. Every living thing was blotted out from the face of the earth. The language leaves no obvious room for geographic exceptions. It seems designed specifically to eliminate the possibility of survivors anywhere. And there's the problem of the mountains. Genesis 7. Verse 20 says the waters rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains. If we're talking about a regional flood, how could water rise above the mountains of one area and not spread to adjacent regions? Water doesn't stay contained within arbitrary boundaries. The third theory, the oldest in Jewish and early Christian tradition, proposes there was a second incursion. The spiritual beings who fathered the original Nephilim before the flood, or other beings of the same category, repeated the process at some point after the waters receded. The genetic contamination happened again. The post-flood Nephilim weren't survivors of the waters. They were a new generation produced by the same method that had created the first. This theory keeps the universality of the flood intact. All the original Nephilim died, but new ones were generated afterward, and it finds support in textual details that are easy to miss in a superficial reading. Genesis 6 verse 4 contains a phrase that has intrigued scholars for centuries. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The expression "and also afterward" is strange in context. After what? Some argue it refers to the period immediately following the marriages described in the previous verse, still within the antediluvian era. Others argue it's an editorial note inserted later by a scribe who knew of the existence of Nephilim in times after the flood. A way of explaining in advance why giants would appear again in Canaan centuries later. If this second reading is correct, the text of Genesis itself acknowledges the Nephilim phenomenon would repeat. But the strongest evidence for the second incursion theory doesn't come from Genesis. It comes from the geographic distribution of the post-flood giants. The biblical texts don't describe giants scattered randomly across the ancient world. They don't appear in Egypt, where Israel lived for centuries. They don't appear in Mesopotamia, where Abraham was born. They don't appear in the nations surrounding Israel on all sides. They appear concentrated in very specific territories. And those territories form a pattern that's hard to ignore. The Rephaim inhabited the region east of the Jordan, specifically in Bashan and Gilead. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 devotes considerable attention to this people. They were numerous, tall, strong. Their land was known as the land of the Rephaim. Og, king of Bashan, was described as the last remnant of the Rephaim. His iron bed, preserved in Rabbah of the Ammonites, measured 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. 4 meters long by 1 meter 80 wide. A bed built for a man of proportions that defied normal human biology. The Emim lived in Moab, east of the Dead Sea. Deuteronomy 2 verses 10 and 11 describes them as a people great, numerous and tall as the Anakim. The Moabites themselves called them Emim, a word meaning the terrible ones, or those who cause dread. They were considered Rephaim, just like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them by another name. The Zamzumim, also known as Zuzim, inhabited the region that would later belong to the Ammonites. Deuteronomy 2 verse 21 says they were a people great, numerous and tall as the Anakim. The Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites so they could possess their land. The Anakim concentrated in the hill country of Hebron, right in the center of Canaan. They were descendants of Arba, whom the Bible describes as the greatest man among the Anakim. Arba founded the city of Kiriath Arba, meaning city of Arba, later renamed Hebron. From Arba descended Anak, and from Anak descended 3 main clans, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. These were the giants the 12 spies encountered. These were the ones who made all Israel seem like grasshoppers in their own eyes. The Avim inhabited villages in southern Canaan, in the region that would later be occupied by the Philistines. Deuteronomy 2, verse 23, briefly mentions that the Caphtorim, ancestors of the Philistines, destroyed them and settled in their place, but the Avim were associated with the same category of anomalous peoples. Place this distribution on a map, and the pattern emerges with disturbing clarity. The giants were positioned exactly on the entry routes into the Promised Land. They occupied the mountain passes any invading army would need to cross. They controlled the strategic valleys connecting different regions of Canaan. They guarded the access points as if they were deliberately positioned sentinels. It was as if someone had placed guardians at the gates, a defensive line designed specifically to prevent Israel from taking possession of the land God had promised Abraham 400 years earlier. Not a natural distribution of different populations, a strategic barrier. The second incursion theory suggests this wasn't historical coincidence, it was deliberate spiritual strategy. If spiritual beings hostile to the divine plan knew about the promise made to Abraham, it would make sense they would try to prevent its fulfillment. The same tactic from Genesis 6, corrupting the human lineage, repeated with an even more specific objective. Not just contaminating humanity in general, physically blocking the promised land with beings Israel couldn't defeat by their own strength. The first incursion nearly destroyed all humanity. It required a global flood to resolve. The second incursion was more surgical, concentrated, focused on a single objective, preventing one specific nation from fulfilling its prophetic destiny. Evidence from neighboring cultures adds interesting layers to this discussion. The Sumerians, one of the oldest known civilizations, recorded detailed stories about beings called Apkallu. They were described as semi-divine counselors, part man and part something else, who existed before the Great Flood. Mesopotamian texts preserve memory of an antediluvian period when the barrier between heaven and earth was more porous, when celestial beings interacted directly with humans in ways that no longer happen. The Sumerian flood account, recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh and other sources, mentions that Utnapishtim, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, wasn't the only survivor. The text suggests certain beings and certain knowledge persisted beyond the catastrophe. Ancient traditions preserved memory of continuity, where the biblical account emphasizes total rupture. The Canaanites worshipped the Rephaim as ancestral spirits of special status. Ugaritic texts from the second millennium before Christ, discovered at Ras Shamra in modern Syria, mentioned the Rephaim as a class of beings in the underworld who possessed power and knowledge beyond ordinary dead. The term was used both for living giants and for their spirits after death. This direct association between physical giants and post-mortem spiritual reality suggests ancient peoples understood these beings as fundamentally different from normal humans. Not just taller, ontologically distinct. The Egyptians, during the centuries Israel was in slavery, maintained detailed records of their military campaigns in Canaan. The execration texts of the Middle Kingdom, ceramic artifacts inscribed with curses against Egypt's enemies, mention Canaanite rulers with names and titles some scholars associate with giant lineages. Military reports from the New Kingdom dynasties, especially from pharaohs like Thutmose III and Rameses II, describe combat against warriors of unusual physical capabilities in Levantine campaigns. None of these sources conclusively proves the existence of supernatural hybrids, but all confirm that the ancient world, consistently across multiple civilizations that had no direct contact with each other, preserved memory of beings of anomalous proportions and nature inhabiting specific regions of the Middle East. The biblical account doesn't exist in a cultural vacuum. It's part of a corpus of traditions crossing civilizational, linguistic, and temporal boundaries. The conquest of Canaan under Joshua takes on a completely different dimension when viewed through this lens. God didn't send Israel simply to take a beautiful land and expel its inconvenient inhabitants. He commanded them to execute Cherem against specific populations. The Hebrew word Cherem means total devotion, usually translated as complete destruction or ban. It was the most extreme form of holy war. Nothing could be spared, no plunder could be taken. Everything had to be completely destroyed. And this command wasn't universal. Deuteronomy 20 makes explicit distinction between two types of warfare. For distant cities not belonging to the Canaanite nations, Israel could offer terms of peace. If the city surrendered, the inhabitants would become servants, but they would live. If it resisted, the men would be killed, but women, children, and animals could be taken as plunder. But for the cities of the Canaanite nations, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the rule was different. You shall not leave alive anything that breathes. You shall utterly destroy them. No exception, no negotiation, no mercy. The severity of this command deeply troubles modern readers. It seems to contradict everything we know about God's nature revealed in other parts of Scripture. How can the same God, who is love, command total extermination of entire populations, including women and children? But if these peoples carried non-human genetic contamination, the command makes sense within the same logic as the flood. It wasn't genocide of an ethnic group for reasons of prejudice. It was surgical elimination of a biological contamination threatening humanity's integrity. The same reason that justified destroying the entire earth with water now justified destroying specific populations with the sword. Preserving pure humanity by eliminating what corrupted it. Continuing the work the flood had begun, but that somehow needed to be completed. Joshua executed methodical campaigns against the giant concentrations, as if following a list. Hebron was conquered first among the cities of the Anakim. The three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai were expelled. Caleb, at 85 years old, specifically claimed that mountainous region. The same Caleb who 40 years earlier, as one of the 12 spies, had said Israel could defeat the giants. Now, after 4 decades of waiting, he had the opportunity to prove his faith with his own sword. Debir was taken next, also called Kiriath Sefer, City of the Book. The hill country of Judah was systematically swept. Joshua 11, verse 21, records the campaign's result in direct language. At that time, Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. But the following verse adds a crucial detail that determines future events. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. 3 cities, all Philistine. The surviving giants, those who escaped Joshua's campaigns, took refuge among the Philistines on the coast. And it's from exactly one of those cities 3 generations later that the most famous giant in all the Bible emerges, Goliath of Gath. 1 Samuel 17 describes his proportions with precision, suggesting eyewitness testimony. 6 cubits and a span in height. Using the standard cubit of approximately 45 centimeters, that gives roughly 2 meters 90 centimeters, nearly 3 meters tall, his armor was proportional to his body. The bronze coat of mail weighed 5,000 shekels, approximately 57 kilograms of metal just for torso protection. The iron head of his spear weighed 600 shekels, nearly 7 kilograms. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, too thick for normal human hands to wield. A shield-bearer walked ahead of him carrying an additional shield. Goliath himself was already so overloaded with bronze and iron, he needed an assistant for extra protection. For 40 consecutive days, twice a day, morning and evening, this being of impossible proportions descended into the valley of Elah and challenged the armies of Israel. No Israelite soldier accepted the challenge, not even King Saul, who was described as the tallest man in Israel, a head above everyone else. The confrontation between David and Goliath wasn't simply a battle between an unarmed young shepherd and a veteran warrior. It was a confrontation between lineages, between Abraham's chosen seed and the remnant of the Nephilim, between God's plan for humanity and the corruption that sought to destroy it. David chose 5 stones from the brook before facing Goliath. Popular tradition assumes they were spares, reserves in case he missed the first throw. But there was another reason. 2 Samuel 21 reveals Goliath wasn't alone. He had 4 relatives in Gath, all of equally monstrous proportions, all descendants of the Rephaim. Ishbi-Benob, whose bronze spear weighed 300 shekels, nearly attacked David years later in a battle and almost killed him. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, intervened in time and killed the giant. Saph, another descendant of the Rephaim, was killed by Sibbecai the Hushathite. A third giant, whom the text doesn't name but identifies as a native of Gath, had 24 fingers and toes, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. He was killed by Jonathan, David's nephew, and Lami, Goliath's brother, whose spear also had a shaft like a weaver's beam, was killed by Elhanan's son of Jair. David took 5 stones because he knew there were 5 giants to kill. 2 Samuel 21, verse 22, concludes the section with a statement that closes a cycle of history. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. After this record, absolute silence. The giants completely disappear from biblical narratives. No mention in Kings, no mention in Chronicles, no mention in the prophets, no mention in any later book of the canon. The lineage of post-flood Nephilim, which had terrorized Israel for generations, was apparently extinguished during David's reign. The barrier had been removed. The gatekeepers had fallen. The promised land was finally clean, but the original question remains partially without definitive answer. How exactly did the Nephilim arise after the flood? The second incursion theory, despite its antiquity and internal coherence, faces a significant theological objection. Jude verse 6 says, "The angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day." 2 Peter 2 verse 4 confirms that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. These texts are generally interpreted as references to the angels of Genesis 6. The beings responsible for the first contamination were imprisoned, chained, removed from circulation. If those responsible for the first incursion were bound in chains of darkness, who would be responsible for the second? Some traditions answer that not all beings involved in the first incursion were captured. Perhaps some escaped. Perhaps the imprisonment was applied only to the leaders, not to all participants. Other traditions suggest different beings, not necessarily the same individuals from the first incursion, repeated the offense. The spiritual world contains multitudes of beings. The punishment of some wouldn't necessarily prevent others from attempting the same thing. Still others argue that the nature of the imprisonment described in Jude and Peter doesn't completely eliminate the capacity for influence. Chained in darkness doesn't necessarily mean without any possibility of action in the physical world. Rabbinic tradition offers a completely different possibility that requires no angelic activity after the flood. The Talmud and later Jewish texts discuss the possibility that genetic information from the Nephilim survived through the wives of Noah's sons. Noah was perfect in his generations, but the text doesn't say the same about his wife or about the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. If any of those 4 women carried traces of contamination in recessive form, inactive but present, those traits could theoretically have resurfaced in later generations when the right genetic combinations occurred. This theory requires no new supernatural activity, just Mendelian genetics applied to an unusual context. But this explanation also faces serious problems. If the contamination was hidden in the DNA of the wives on the ark, why did giants appear only in specific regions of Canaan? Why not in all populations descended from Noah scattered across the world? The concentrated geographic distribution of post-flood giants, clustered specifically on the access routes to the Promised Land, suggests localized and intentional origin, not universal inheritance that manifested randomly in some places and not others. The coincidence would be too extraordinary. Archaeologists and historians continue debating these questions without definitive consensus. Excavations in various regions of the ancient Middle East have found human skeletal remains of proportions significantly above average. Tombs in Bashan, the land of Og, graves in the Hebron region. Bones suggesting individuals of stature far superior to the population norm of the era. No 3-meter skeleton has been found and scientifically verified, but bones indicating height of 2 meters or more in populations where the male average was 1.60 meters are sufficient to explain the psychological impact these individuals caused. Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Hittite, and Ugaritic texts all preserve references to beings of extraordinary stature or capability in contexts that go beyond mere mythology. There's too much consistency among sources that had no direct contact. Too much memory of something that, according to the modern view, should never have existed. The biblical accounts of the Nephilim don't exist in isolation. They're part of a corpus of traditions, crossing civilizational, linguistic, and temporal boundaries. The entire ancient world seemed to remember something the modern world prefers to forget. The traditional theological explanation points to a second incursion of spiritual beings after the flood, repeating the pattern of Genesis 6 with the specific strategic objective of blocking God's redemptive plan. The naturalistic explanation suggests Nephilim was simply a generic term for any group of warriors of great physical stature, impressive men that ancient cultures mythologized and exaggerated over generations of oral transmission until they became the giants of legend. The historical truth may lie somewhere between these two positions, or it may lie beyond both, in territory that neither traditional theology nor modern science can fully map. What we know with certainty is limited but significant. The biblical texts record the existence of beings called Nephilim before the flood, associated with a corruption that contaminated the entire earth. They record a global flood that destroyed all flesh, including these beings. They record the reappearance of beings identified by the same name, Nephilim, in Canaan centuries later, concentrated in strategic territories. And they record the systematic elimination of these beings during Joshua's conquest and David's wars until none remained in the lands of Israel. The exact mechanism by which Nephilim existed after the flood, whether new, supernatural creation, genetic resurgence, or simply application of an ancient term to a new phenomenon, remains debated. What happened between Genesis and Numbers, between the waters that covered the earth and the spies who brought back grapes and terror, remains one of the most fascinating and most debated mysteries of ancient history. The giants died in the flood, and somehow they were back when Israel arrived to claim their inheritance. This apparent contradiction, this paradox that has troubled readers for 3 millennia, still awaits an answer that fully satisfies both faith and reason. Perhaps some questions exist not to be answered, but to remind us that history is stranger, deeper, and more mysterious than our systems can contain.